Hello, my name is Dennis, and welcome to my trailer park white trash mobile home kitchen. I really do live in a mobile home, in a trailer park, and this is my kitchen. Today, I'm going to be fulfilling a request that came in through the website. Someone asked me to do cinnamon swirl bread, which I have never done, but I thought that could be fun. Let's do this. The ingredients I'm going to be giving you is for making one loaf, and you're going to see that everything is doubled. I'm actually going to be making 2 loaves because I'm going to be using half of what I've got for an experiment, and I'll show you that experiment. If it fails, well, then it fails. If it's really successful, who knows? I could win the Betty Crocker International Award for culinary accomplishment, and if not that, well, maybe at the very least a Nobel Award. Anyways, let's get into the ingredients I'm going to use. Now, as I said earlier, these proportions are doubled because I'm going to be doing an experiment. To make a single loaf, you need 1 1/8 cup, 260 milliliters of warm water. I'm going to be warming this up to a temperature of about 110 degrees Fahrenheit, 43 degrees Celsius. 1 packet or 1 sachet of active dry or instant yeast, that's about 2 1/4 to 2 1/2 teaspoons. 2 tablespoons honey, 3 1/2 cups sifted all-purpose flour. You can use bread flour. I weigh my flour for baking like this, so I'm using 1 pound, 454 grams of flour. 1 teaspoon of salt. You can omit that if you're going to use whole butter, which I'm going to use. I have 4 tablespoons, 45 grams of butter. That's at room temperature. If you want to use unsalted butter, a lot of bakers do, then just add a teaspoon of salt. If you like raisins, you can add a 1/2 cup of raisins, 65 grams. For this, my experiment, I'm going to be using some dried cranberries. I'll show you that when I get to it. And then 1/4 cup packed, 57 grams, brown sugar, 4 teaspoons cinnamon, 2 teaspoons flour, 2 tablespoons butter and extra for greasing the pans, and then finally 1 egg that I'm going to be using with 1 or 2 teaspoons of water to make an egg wash. I'm going to start off by making a sponge. So I put roughly half my flour in my mixer bowl. I'm going to add my warm water. This is to activate the yeast, so I'm adding my yeast and my honey. And then I'm going to mix this up into kind of like a wet batter. This is what they call a sponge. And then I'm going to cover this with plastic, leave it in a warm place for 5 to 10 minutes. This sponge should get bubbly, even a little bit of foam on top as that yeast activates. And then I'll be ready to add the remainder of my flour and then work butter into this to make my dough for my bread. My sponge is all nice and bubbly now. So I put it in my stand mixer. I'm going to be adding my flour, a spoonful so at a time, until I get most of my flour, pretty near all of it worked in. I want a dough that will be just a little bit sticky. It'll separate from the sides of the bowl but stick just a little bit in the bottom. If it separates completely from the bottom, that's okay because I still have butter to add, which will add moisture. So I'm going to set this on my number 2 setting and start working in my flour. So there is my dough ball in there. It's just a little bit sticky, as you can see from the dough on my fingers. That's the way I want it. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to knead this for about 6 to 8 minutes in the machine. And then I have my 4 tablespoons of butter here that a little at a time I'm going to work that into the dough until it's all fully incorporated and smooth. So there's my dough. As you can see, it's slightly sticking there to the bottom of the bowl. That's what I want. If you've never added butter to dough before, you might be in for a surprise. It will break up, fall apart because the butter and the moisture in the dough don't want to mix. And you could panic, oh my gosh, what did I do wrong? Be patient with it. Keep working it, working it, working it. That butter will incorporate and it'll get nice and smooth like that. You won't see any separation at all. So now I'm going to transfer this to a greased bowl and let this rise. I like to use the same mixing bowl to let my dough rise in. I greased the inside of this bowl with butter, pressed my dough into the bottom, and then using my little plastic bag that I used for greasing the dough, the bowl rather, I'm just going to grease the top of this dough well, because what's going to happen is this rises up. It's going to rise up against the plastic wrap that I put over the top, and I don't want it to stick. So there's my plastic wrap. I'm going to put this in a warm place. My favorite place is on top of the refrigerator, and I estimate this is going to take about an hour to double in bulk. It should rise up just over the top of the upper edge of this bowl. My dough has been rising for 1 hour. See how that's come up over the top of that bowl? That's what I was planning on. I'm going to punch this down temporarily, deflate it, and set this aside while I mix my cinnamon filling to go inside my bread. So in a relatively small, or let's just say a medium-sized bowl here, I'm going to put my brown sugar, my cinnamon, flour, and the 2 tablespoons of butter. And then I'm going to combine this. I'm going to go kind of slow because that cinnamon is like really fine facial powder, and it'll kind of cloud up. I'm going to use a knife here to scrape my spatula here until I get this completely blended. You want to blend this until it's smooth. Okay, I think that's got it pretty well smoothed out. Enough. I'm going to divide this roughly in half, because as I mentioned, I want to experiment. So I'm going to be using half of this in my dough for the loaf of bread and half in my experiment. So there's my dough. I've deflated that down pretty well. I'm going to take half of that and put that away from my experiment. And then what I want to do, I'm going to dust this with flour. I want to shape a rectangle that'll be about the width of my bread pan here. So this is what I'm looking for the width, and maybe as long as this cutting board. And I'm just going to shape this with my hands. No need to use a rolling pin here. This is kind of like shaping a pizza dough. You don't have to be too fancy here. Dust that a little bit more. Okay, let's see what I've got there. That'll be pretty good. And then I combined an egg with a teaspoon or 2 of water to make an egg wash. I'm going to paint this with egg wash. This is going to act like a glue because I'm not going to do a complete layer of cinnamon filling over this. I'm going to leave some white areas so that the dough can stick to itself when I roll this up, and that'll prevent the bread slices from completely falling apart when I slice the bread. All right, and then I'm going to sprinkle my filling on here. Again, about half of the filling that I made earlier, because everything is doubled. Okay. And then kind of just spread this around a little bit, but leave some white spaces. Work it to the edge. I'm going to leave an edge here that's got a little bit of a border there. Down to the end here. Okay, going to rinse my hands and then I'm going to start rolling this up. So now starting at one end here, I'm going to roll up from my narrow end. All right, and then I'm going to pinch my ends of my roll here together to enclose that, and then pinch and seal this final seam. That is now ready to go into my loaf pan, which I'm going to grease with some butter. So here's my greased loaf pan. Just grease that with some butter. And then I'm going to carefully lay this down in there, seam side down. Just kind of pat that down in there. Here's my bag that I use for greasing the pan. I'm going to pat the top of this with some butter. Like so. Nice, nice, nice. And then I'm going to cover this with loosely with a sheet of plastic wrap and let this rise for maybe 45 minutes, could go an hour. I want to see it rise up well over the top of this loaf pan. So I have spread my other piece of dough out for my experiment. Let's get into what I'm going to be doing here. Again, coating this with egg wash. And then the remainder of my, yeah, I don't think I need that in my cinnamon swirl. Kind of reminds me of one of those old Three Stooges videos where the oddest things ended up in their baked breads and cakes. Again, crumble this all over the place. Spread that around, still leaving some white space. You can hear that dog barking in the background. Those are the imbeciles that live behind me. They have the yappiest little dog. Can't stand that little dog. Okay, let me rinse my hands and then I'm going to do my next step. So now I'm going to sprinkle on my dried cranberries. Because I think they'll give it a nice flavor. I don't care for raisins, so I'm not going to use raisins, but I like dried cranberries, dried cherries. Okay, so then starting at one of the long ends, I'm going to start rolling this dough up into a long roll, like so. And when I get to the end here, same thing, pinch the dough together to close that seam, pinch the ends. Doesn't matter that this is seam side down, but there's my roll. And let me show you my next step. Going to use my knife here now to cut this in half. And then cut each of these in half. and then cut these in thirds. So that I have 12 pieces like that. So why 12? Because I have 12 cups to my muffin tin here. So what I want to do is take each of these and place them in my muffin tins, or the cups of my muffin tin. So that I'm going to be making little cinnamon swirl muffins. That's my experiment. So there they are. Now I'm going to cover this like the loaf with a piece of plastic wrap and let this rise. These are going to rise, I would say, for about 45 minutes, 30 to 45 minutes. So these are now getting ready to go into the oven. I have the oven heating up to 350 degrees. That's about 177 degrees Celsius. And I'm going to bake these 35 to 40 minutes, I'm estimating. So those are the muffins, the cinnamon swirl muffins. Could put that back on. And then here is my bread, nicely risen like I wanted it, well above the top of the pan. In the oven, that's going to come up a little bit more. So when my oven comes up to temperature, I'm going to bake these, and I'm estimating 30, 35, 40 minutes for both of these in the oven. I'm estimating my time for baking these, but I'm going to actually use an instant read thermometer when the internal temperature of my bread comes up to 190 degrees or above Fahrenheit, which is 88 or higher Celsius. That's the indication that it's baked all the way through. I wanted you to see the cinnamon swirl muffins coming fresh from the oven. I baked these for a total of 30 minutes because I wanted to see some nice browning on top. I left the bread in. I'm going to bake that for maybe another 10 minutes because there isn't quite enough browning on that yet. And I did in the meantime make some frosting because I thought these might benefit from a nice little coating of frosting on top. I didn't measure anything here. I probably started with a cup of confectioner's sugar. I put maybe half a teaspoon of vanilla in there and then started adding heavy cream, teaspoon at a time, just a little splash at a time, and I kept mixing that up until I got a nice frosting that it's spreadable. That's what I want. All right, after another 10 minutes, there's my bread out of the oven. Got a nice hollow sound to it, nicely browned. Again, I have to wait for this to cool, and then I'll be able to slice this and see what it looks like inside. These have had a chance to cool down some, so I'm just kind of swirling some frosting on top. Not a lot of frosting, just to give them a nice look. The swirl will kind of go with the swirl of the cinnamon roll. This is cooled down enough that I should be able to slice this. I'm going to cut in quite a ways here because that's where the best part of the bread I think will be. This end part here won't be as pretty, I don't think, as the inside. The reveal. Let's see what this looks like. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful cinnamon swirl bread. Doesn't that look delicious? Okay, I gotta see how these things taste. So I put one of these on a little dish for myself. That is surprisingly good. It has that nice homemade bread texture to it. Okay, that is delicious, not overly sweet. I don't like things cloyingly sweet. That is just delicious, so excuse me, but I'm going to go enjoy my cinnamon swirl muffin. And as for that bread, I think I'll toast and butter that later. For a printable PDF copy of this recipe with step-by-step photographs, visit the White Trash Cooking website and look on the home page or in the recipe archive.